This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Today we're talking about temperature controlling your fermentation. Why on earth you would want to do that, ways that you can do it on the cheap, and what a fermentation chamber is and how it can help you. How's it going, chasers? I hope you're having a kick-ass week. I'm Jesse and this is Still It, and we're talking about fermentation chambers today. The first thing I think we want to tackle is why on earth would you actually want to adjust the temperature of your wash as it's fermenting in the first place? Why is that a thing? Well, if the temperature gets too low, the yeast can get sluggish, it doesn't do its job very well. Long story short, the time period of your fermentation can be really, really long. And if it gets even a little bit colder than that, the yeast can just straight up go dormant and do nothing. Now, different yeasts like to ferment at different temperature ranges, and for different reasons, you might want to even push that same certain yeast further to the top or further to the bottom. And there's just so many combinations of those two things that speaking in specifics aren't going to be very helpful. So instead of speaking in specifics, let's, for the sake of this video, talk relatively in terms of hot versus cold. Too cold, the yeast's slow, or it straight up just does nothing, it goes to sleep. On the other side of things, however, if it gets a little bit too hot, you can start throwing crazy flavors into the wash that you don't really like. The yeast starts getting stressed out. Things can get a little bit weird and overly fusely, or if you really, really push the temperature too high, once again, we're getting into the territory now where the yeast is just going to stop doing its job because it's given up the ghost, basically. Neither of those things are what you want, right? There's another couple of reasons too that I really should point out right at the beginning, which in my mind are a whole lot more exciting than that. And both of these come down to being able to do things that you shouldn't be able to do based on where you are on the globe and the season you are in. So for example, for me right now in New Zealand, ambient temperature is about 12 degrees Celsius. That's cold. Or heaven forbid, I'm trying to use Kvike and pushing up to 40 degrees Celsius. You know, that's just not going to happen with ambient temperature. It's not an option. Being able to adjust the temperature that you have gives you the ability to ferment styles of beverages that you shouldn't be able to do at your house at that point in time. And the last thing is consistency. If we can dial in the temperature, make it the same every time we ferment something, we take that off the table as a variable, and it means that we can have a more consistent product. Or we can mess with something else, you know, like change a different variable up or down or left or right or whatever we happen to be doing, and removing temperature as another variable means we can focus on this one over here. So these are all the reasons that I think this is important to be able to do, at least to some degree, at home. So what is a fermentation chamber actually? So let's talk about what it does, not what it is, because there's different ways that we could put this thing together. The main idea is that it needs a way to heat things up if it's getting too cold. It needs a way to cool things down if it's getting too hot. It needs a way to monitor the temperature of the wash, and then something that puts all of those things together. It knows the temperature we're trying to hit. It knows the temperature that the wash is at this point in time. It looks at the difference between those two things. Is it too hot or is it too cold? If it's too hot, it's going to turn the thing on that does the cooling for us. And if it's too cold, it's going to turn the thing on that does the heating for us. Putting all those things together and then insulating it from the outside world, so some sort of barrier that is going to make it easier for this thing to do its job because it's not so affected by ambient temperature around it. All of those things put together are what I would call a fermentation chamber. I'd like to acknowledge that, no, you don't have to go out and build a fermentation chamber, obviously. Plenty of people that don't have these things make really good booze. So what's the deal with that? Well, I mean, the first thing is look around your house. Is it too hot? Okay. Find a spot in your house that's not so hot. If it's too warm and you've got a basement that is a more regular temperature more often, put your fermenter down there. Or in my situation right now, right, it's too cold out here in the shed, so maybe I could squeeze a 30-litre fermenter inside in the hot water cupboard. Do you think I'd get murdered for that? I don't know. Maybe, but would it be worth it? Probably, yeah. You get the idea, right? Find a place that's warmer or colder depending on what you need. Put your shit there. It's pretty effective. Obviously, sometimes that won't give you as much adjustment as you need. So let's talk about ways that you can cool your fermenter down. So wrap a towel around the outside of the fermenter and get it damp. You can have a spray bottle that you spritz it down with. You can dunk the towel in a bucket and wring it out and wrap it back around. The act of the water on that towel evaporating is going to be a pretty powerful means of cooling what's inside. That's what our bodies do, right? We sweat, the sweat evaporates, cools us down. Make your fermenter sweaty as well. If you want to bump that up even more, you can have a fan, facing at that damp towel around your fermenter. Another way that people use quite a lot that I've seen people mention in forums and so on and so forth is to have a water bath, put the fermenter in the water bath, and then have like empty milk bottles that you fill up with water and freeze. You've got, I don't know, let's say you've got 6 of them. You put 3 in the bath and you have 3 in the freezer, and then you switch them out, or 2, or whatever, you know what I mean? So you're cycling stuff between the freezer and the water bath to keep the temperature way down. Let's flip over to warming the bad boy up, shall we? Most of these are going to benefit significantly if you can, once again, insulate the area that you're working in. So if you have a cupboard under your bench in your shed that you can whack this into that's a confined space, that's going to help. If you can, I don't know, like put together a couple of stools and drape some woolen blankets over it, that's going to help a whole lot too, because you're not heating a giant space for no reason. But how do you heat it? Space saver heaters are wonderful. They're kind of overkill a lot of the time though, unless you're really trying to lift up a fair bit of temperature gap. Heating pads, heating belts, and all of those sort of things that are purpose-built solutions that you can buy at brew stores are great. They may not have a whole lot of heating power, but you probably don't need a whole lot either. Electric fish tank heaters are not a bad option either. Just make sure that the wattage is relevant for the size of fermenter you're dealing with. Honestly, guys, a light bulb. Yes, just a light bulb, an old school light bulb, not an LED one. You know what I'm talking about. One of those in a properly insulated little space can be a pretty crazily efficient heating tool. And the best part is too, if you want to turn the heating down a little bit, you take the 100-watt light bulb out, you put the 75-watt light bulb in. Electric blankets, they're great as well. With all of these methods, we're going to talk about this a little bit later on. With all of these methods, remember that fire safety and electrical safety is a big thing. So having a heater in a confined space, I hope you're picking up what I'm putting down here, and having any sort of electrical appliance with a big old bucket of stuff that is probably going to start bubbling and may bubble over. You get what I'm saying, right? Obviously, you also need to know the temperature of the wash, so you know whether it's too hot or too cold. And, there's a bunch of different ways you can do this. But honestly, guys, one of those slap-on, stick-on, I don't remember what they're called. I'll figure out what they're called and put the name up here. The thermometers that you stick on the outside of fermenters. Not overly accurate, but none of these techniques are overly accurate either. They're going to give you a pretty good idea of what's happening. And the last thing I'll say is, if you're just rolling in cash, or you're just completely dedicated to, really nailing your temperatures, you can, of course, just get a Glycol and heater set up as well. Have a jacketed conical and a Glycol set up, and Bob's your uncle. You're not going to have to worry about any of this stuff. You might have to explain to your wife where your child's inheritance went, but that's your problem. Luckily, you don't have to be rolling in cash or a coding machine to make your own website. Squarespace, today's sponsor, has you covered. If you've been thinking about creating your own website, I can completely and wholeheartedly recommend Squarespace. Why? Because I used it to create chasethecraft.com, and it's great. Squarespace really does make making a website accessible to just about anyone. Why do you want a website? Maybe you want to create a portfolio, or you want to start a blog. You need a way to legitimize your restaurant, your distillery, your other business, or you want to start your own e-commerce business from the comfort of your own home. Whatever your reason, Squarespace has a bunch of awesome templates ready that'll fit your aesthetic. All you need to do is add your own media and your own text, and you're off to the races. To make things even better, Squarespace is already set up to help you sell products, take bookings, or even make a mailing list to help keep your clientele or your readers engaged. So don't mess around. Get your own website today. Go to squarespace.com to get a free trial. And when you're ready to purchase, don't forget about me. Go to squarespace.com/stillit to get 10% off your website or domain. All right, let's get on to the main point of this video. If you remember back to those things that I said that I thought a fermentation chamber needs to do, in my mind, the trickiest one of those things to solve is cooling. There's not a lot of things in our everyday life that is going to allow us to cool something automatically to a specific degree that we want it to. And because of that, choosing how you're going to solve this problem now is going to help you figure out the rest of the problem solving process. And there's two main options that I'm going to suggest, and one is by far my favorite. Fridges. Fridges are cheap. You can get them secondhand, and people get rid of them for silly reasons. There's a crack in one of the shelves. The little divider thingy in the door fell out and they lost it. So they sell it and buy a new one. You can get these things all over the place. But there are a few things I would really suggest looking for. Number one is get a upright fridge without a freezer. We're going to be turning this thing on and off to adjust the amount of cooling power it's giving pretty much by just flicking the switch on the wall on and off. That's effectively what we're going to be doing. So if you can have a fridge that doesn't have a freezer to suck up extra energy that we're not really using for anything, great. It's more space too. Number two is the size of the thing. If you're just doing little 30-liter, like fermentation carboys or those plastic bucket things, you can get away with a lot. Even a little, like a college bar fridge, some of those will fit a fermenter that size in it. But for, if you're starting to move up and ferment a little bit more product, if you want to fit multiple of those in there, or perhaps a 100-liter, 75-liter fermenter in there, you might need to start looking for something a little bit bigger. In that case, you can start looking for secondhand drinks fridges, secondhand fridges out of kitchens, even some sort of home products where people have a separate fridge and a separate freezer. Those kind of fridges are great. You get the idea. Look for the right size. Another option is chest freezers, and these are great because they are generally much bigger volumes and in some ways sort of more easily usable space. The problem with freezers is not that they're too cold. We're going to control that later on. The problem is that you need to lift stuff in and lift stuff out. And once again, if you've got a 100-liter fermenter and you're bending over like this, good freaking luck, unless you've got a pump set up to pump everything out of there. For me, that's why I don't use them. But if you are just kicking around with 20, 30-liter fermenters, it's an option. The second sort of whole different category of cooling here is AC units, air conditioning units. We don't need to get down to crazy low temperatures. We just need to bump the temperature in the right direction. So they've got more than enough power to do it. It's just more complicated. Every time I've looked into using an air conditioner, there's always problems I run into, problems that don't quite line up. They're a little bit more finicky to control, at least a lot of them are. Like, just flicking them on and off at the wall doesn't necessarily do what you would hope it would do. And the other thing is too, they're much more likely to heat the space up outside of the space that you're using. So if you've got a box built in the corner, you're going to be heating the shit out of your room, for example, much more than a fridge. I don't quite understand why that works, why that is the case. Someone explain that to me in the comments. I'm not a refrigeration expert. If you do want to go down the road of having almost like a walk-in fridge in your shed, for example, or a walk-in temperature-controlled room, having an air conditioner unit coming in through the wall of the shed is a great option. And there's a product out there called Coolbot. I'll put a link in the description down below. In fact, I'll put as many links to these different things that I think will help you out as I can. Coolbot will help you out. Honestly, guys, my recommendation on all of this is the vertical fridges. The second most difficult part of this whole thing to get set up is the unit that controls all of it. And this used to be a really expensive, really frustrating part of the hobby if you wanted to control fermentation to this level. But that's completely changed now, totally changed. STC 1000s are the kind of old school semi-DIY go-to for this. They're not PIDs, they're not doing anything crazy, they're just literally saying, too hot, cool. Too cool, heat. Or it's okay, do nothing. That's all they're doing, and they do a damn good job of it. You will need some basic DIY electrical skills, which basically comes down to, putting in a couple of plugs. You don't even need a solder, they're just screw terminals, but there you have it. I'm not going to go into that. Not an electrician. Don't want that shit on my conscience. You get the idea. That's an option. The second option, if you don't want to mess around with any of that sort of stuff, are the Inkbird controllers. And these things are like 35 bucks, I think. I'll chuck a link down there for you. If you can get yourself a $35 Inkbird controller, a secondhand fridge, you're pretty much sorted. Yeah, of course you can go out and DIY it and hook PIDs up or get an Arduino and write some custom code. And I mean, if you're the sort of person that does that, you don't need to be watching this video. You go for it. You're sorted. If you're the sort of person that just enjoys setting a challenge for yourself like that, I mean, yeah, sure, go for it. I just don't think it's really going to save you time or money anymore with the products that are on the market. Let's talk insulation. If you've got a fridge, like I suggested in the step 1, you're sorted, aren't you? Because those things are literally insulated boxes that cool things down. The only thing we need to do is now figure out how to heat it up as well. More on that in a second. But honestly, guys, fridges are great for this because they're really well insulated and the amount of energy you're going to use is going to be less because they're well insulated. If you don't want to use a fridge, or you can't use a fridge, or you want to make something custom for your area, the foam insulation that you can buy at the hardware store, for example, would be a pretty good option. But I mean, you get it, guys. There's a lot of different ways to skin this cat, right? And lastly, heating, guys. Now, this is going to vary hugely depending on the amount of heat you need, how hot you want it to get, how quickly you want it to heat up. Big range. Personally, I tend to use a space saver heater because, I don't know, I like having the hammer. I like being able to heat stuff up quickly. If I want to pitch the yeast and it's not warm enough, I can, crank this thing up, get it warming up fairly quickly and be able to pitch sooner. If I want to, speed ramp temperatures, I can. If it is 10 degrees outside and I want to be fermenting at 40 degrees for Kvike, easy, no problems whatsoever. I just don't have to think about it. But honestly, all of those other things that I talked about before are great options too. A light bulb in a fridge is going to heat it up a fair bit. A heating pad or a heating belt or a heating blanket for the fermenter are great options as well. The common thing between all of these things are that they need to plug into something, right? We're going to have something that plugs into an electrical socket, and that electrical socket is how the Inkbird or the STC is going to control the heating cycle. So the Inkbird or the STC 1000 are going to have 2 plugs coming out the back of it, or 2 plugs to plug into. One of those is to control the thing that cools things down. That's the fridge. So that's easy. The fridge just plugs right on into the cooling plug. The heating one is a little bit more tricky though, because we've got to get that cable inside the fridge. A couple of different ways to do this. I've seen people cut notches out of the sealing gasket on the inside of the fridge. They can just, put a cable through and then close it on it. Problem with that is it kills the seal, so the door may not stay closed. Obviously, it's not as good at insulating. That's a bit of a problem. The other way is to drill through the door and just literally wire up a cable that just stays there all the time. The other thing that we need to get inside is the thermocouple, so it can actually monitor the temperature of the fermenter, right? Same deal here. You can go through the gasket, you can go through the door of the fridge, drill a hole. I went through the door so I don't have to mess around with, the gasket not sealing and all that sort of stuff. A quick note that you would do well to listen to. Some fridges actively cool only with, the chiller plate inside the fridge. Some fridges have cooling lines running in all sorts of different places throughout the fridge. The last thing you want to do is drill through the side of the fridge and hit one of those cooling lines. That's going to render the whole thing useless. For that reason, if you want to be safe and you can't be bothered, trying to literally find schematics for that fridge somewhere, go through the door. That's normally safe. All right, so now we have a fridge that is plugged into the Inkbird. The Inkbird's plugged into the wall. The Inkbird or the STC 1000 is monitoring the temperature of the fermentation vessel itself. If it gets too hot, it turns on the little port that is marked cooling, and that in turn turns on the fridge. If it gets too cold, on the other hand, it'll turn on the port or the plug that is for heating. We've got running now into the inside of the fridge, and whatever system you're using to heat the inside is going to turn on. And the good thing about this is if you just have a plug inside the fridge, you can unplug your space saver heater because you don't need that much. You can plug in a lamp, you can plug in an electric blanket, whatever you want to use on the inside, right? Now, let's revisit the beginning of this video where I said, be careful, fire safety and electrical safety. We now have a fridge, which is basically a sealed area with a fermenter inside it full of a bubbling liquid that may squirt out the top. So just keep that in mind when you have, especially a space saver heater inside. Have a way that the heater is protected so it's not going to get splashed. Have a way that if a shit ton of liquid comes out, it's not literally sitting in a pool of liquid down the bottom. Potentially use like a what do you call them, like the little surge breaker plugs to plug into. That would be smart. You get it, guys. So I'm just warning given. All right. A couple of things that I would note about how to potentially use these a little bit more effectively, or in the vein that you want to use them in. Number one is, like I said, if you have a fridge and you need more space, it's pretty easy to open the door up, insulate the crap out of an area in front of it, especially if you're mostly using it for heat, not cooling. It's going to be, you'll be surprised how much heavy lifting you can do in that sort of environment. So right now, my fridge over there is set to 26 degrees Celsius, the STC 1000 is. The door's open because I've got a 100-litre fermenter sitting in front of it, and I'm using a space saver heater, and that's kept it at that temperature no problem, even though it's getting down to freezing overnight, and it's, you know, barely scraping 10 degrees during the day right now. Not a problem whatsoever. Once again, fire safety, if I'm doing this sort of stuff, I block off an area so the blankets can't get to the heater. I use woolen blankets because they're kind of fire retardant. You get the idea. Number two, know the difference between free rising temperature, sort of like with a minimum stop, and an exact temperature that you want to hit. A lot of distillers will have a minimum temperature that they want the yeast to be, but they'll let the yeast itself create a free rising temperature in the fermentation. They like the idea that the yeast itself is going to heat the fermentation vessel up, and they let the yeast do that. So if you want to do that, you're basically setting a stop, a safety net at the bottom end of the temperature. And to do that, all you would need to do is unplug the fridge. So the fridge isn't plugged in at all. So this way, the system, say if you set it to 20 degrees, it's not going to let the temperature of the ferment get below 20 degrees Celsius, but it'll let it rise up as high as you want. If it's over 20 degrees, it's doing absolutely nothing. If it's below 20 degrees, it's trying to warm it up a little bit. On the flip side, guys, you can set it to, say, I've got it, mine set right now, as we speak, it's fermenting away at 26 degrees Celsius. If it's warmer than 26 degrees, it's going to pull it back down. If it's colder than 26, it's going to pull it back up. I've got a very specific temperature that I'm holding it at because of all those reasons I talked about before. Mostly consistency. I want to know what this yeast does at that temperature. This leads into probably one of the most important recommendations I can give when using these things, and that is how to place the thermocouple, where you want to put it, how you want to put it. Number one is that you need to make sure that the thermocouple is somehow contacting the liquid. And I don't mean that it actually has to be wet. What I just mean is there's no point sticking it above the liquid line on the fermenter. Me personally, I just literally duct tape it to the outside of the fermenter, right in the middle of the liquid mass. So if the liquid goes from here to here, I'll tape it right about there. And then I'll cover the whole area, like the outside of the thermocouple, in something that's going to insulate it. And the reason for that is simply that if I'm pumping hot air into this chamber through the space saver heater, I don't want the thermocouple reading the air temperature. I want it reading the liquid temperature, if that makes sense. So another tip is to move the thermocouple to the opposite side of the fermenter from your heat source. So if you've got a heat pad on the bottom, don't have the thermocouple taped right next to the heat pad, have it taped up a little bit higher. If you've got a heat belt, for example, tape it on the other side of where the heat belt is. You get the idea, right, guys? You can, of course, take this to the next level and use a Thermowell, which is just a little port that goes in that allows you to stick the thermocouple into it and have better contact with the liquid. That's not a bad option either. Let's talk about settings on these little machines for a second, shall we? There's two things that you're going to need to know how to set. One is the temperature that you want it to be, obviously, and two is the tolerance, or the amount of degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit that the machine will let your fermentation get away from your set temperature. Let's say you've set it at 20 degrees Celsius. When is it going to start actively trying to do something to bring it back to 20 degrees Celsius, right? So I used to have it set in my beer brewing days at I think 0.2 of a degree, which is kind of crazy thinking about it now. So if it was set at 20 degrees Celsius and it got to 20.2, it would start trying to pull it back down. If it got to 18.8, it would start trying to push it back up. You would think that being more accurate is better, but at the end of the day, it's not really a huge difference in terms of the product you're making, and you're going to be using a buttload, a lot more power. Right now, I've got it set to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. Honestly, I can't even remember. I would say right around there is kind of the Goldilocks zone for distilling, personally. And lastly, guys, if you do end up building one of these things, you now have the privilege, the luxury of being able to think in temperature profiles over time. So you don't just have to say, right, I'm going to ferment at 25 degrees Celsius. That's what I'm doing. You don't have to do that. Imagine a graph, time and temperature. You can start at a certain temperature, let it rise up, hold it at a certain temperature for a while, and then crash it way back down. You do whatever you want. That one's probably not such a great idea. What is probably not a horrible idea is to start at the temperature you want to ferment at. As fermentation starts slowing down, you gradually raise the temperature a little bit to eke out any little bit more yeast activity you can and really dry that product out. And then crash it, drop it way back down to 3 degrees Celsius or something, and help that wash clear out before you put it into the still, if that's what you're into. That's one example of how you could use this. I'm just saying, now you have this tool, you can start exploring and experimenting with ways to really use it to your advantage. So, there you have it, guys. I know this video has been a little bit different. If you're still listening to this video now, thank you, I appreciate it. It was a long one. If you enjoyed this kind of stuff, where we just kind of pick a topic and go a little bit longer, let me know in the comment section down below. This video is never going to be 100,000 views video. That's not what this video is. But I'm hoping that every now and again I can find a way to do something for you guys, the core crew of the channel. That doesn't have to be a big video. That doesn't have to be, you know, the one paying the bills. It's something to say thank you to you guys, to help those of you that are interested in this sort of thing out. So if you're into it, let me know in the comment section down below. You guys know what to do with the YouTubey things, like, comment, blah, 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 blah. And I'll catch you next time, guys. Keep on chasing the craft. See ya.